Hawaii isn't just a state, it is a kingdom, and not just in the romantic, historical sense of the word. Behind the postcard sunsets and the volcanic black sand beaches, behind the luxury resorts that line the Kohala coast and the glass penthouses that overlook Diamond Head, there is a system of land ownership so concentrated, so ancient, and so deliberately obscured that most people who visit this state, and even many who live here, have absolutely no idea who really owns the ground beneath their feet. This isn't a story about a corporation. It isn't a story about a hotel chain or a tech billionaire who flew in from Silicon Valley and bought a compound. This is a story about a family, one family, a family so deeply woven into the legal, economic, and political fabric of these islands that to understand Hawaii, you must first understand them. Their name is Bishop, and if that name means nothing to you right now, I promise you that by the end of this, it will mean everything. Before we go any further, if you want to know where the real money is hiding in this world, not in the headlines, not in the Forbes lists, but in the foundations, in the deeds, in the centuries-old trusts that nobody talks about, then subscribe right now. We go where the cameras don't. This is the story of the secret billionaire family that owns Hawaii. To understand the Bishop estate, you have to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the trust, not the beginning of the fortune, but the beginning of the islands themselves as a sovereign nation. Because this story starts with a kingdom. Hawaii was not always American soil. For centuries, it was governed by a monarchy, the Hawaiian Kingdom, a sovereign nation recognized by the great powers of the world, including the United States, Great Britain, and France. The Hawaiian alii, the royal and noble class, controlled the land through a system rooted in ancient tradition. Land wasn't owned in the Western sense. It was held in a sacred custodial relationship. The king was the steward of the land for his people. Then came the Great Mahele of 1848. The Great Mahele is the original sin of Hawaiian land ownership. It is the single moment that changed everything. King Kamehameha III, under enormous pressure from foreign advisors, American missionaries, and Western business interests, issued a formal division of the land. For the first time in Hawaiian history, private individuals could own land. The king retained a vast royal domain. The alii, the chiefs and nobles, were given their own parcels, and the Hawaiian commoners, the maka'ainana, were given the right to claim small kuleana plots, small parcels of land they had farmed for generations. The problem was the process for claiming those kuleana plots was bureaucratic, confusing, and largely inaccessible to people who had no experience navigating Western legal systems. The result was a catastrophe for native Hawaiians. Out of roughly 1 million acres that could have been claimed, ordinary Hawaiians ended up securing fewer than 30,000. The rest was quietly transferred, sold, or absorbed by the crown, the government, and increasingly by wealthy foreigners. The Great Mahele was supposed to democratize land ownership. What it actually did was lay the groundwork for one of the most extraordinary concentrations of private land ownership in American history. Enter Bernice Pauahi Bishop. She was the last direct descendant of the Kamehameha dynasty, the last princess of Hawaii. Born in 1831, Bernice Pauahi was the great-granddaughter of Kamehameha I, the warrior king who had unified the islands. She was by birthright, and by the affection of her people, a figure of immense cultural significance. There were those who wanted her to ascend to the Hawaiian throne. She declined. Her life, while touched by royalty, was also shaped by a deep and genuine love for the Hawaiian people, particularly for Hawaiian children, who she watched with growing sorrow lose their language, their land, and their future in the face of Western colonization. When Princess Pauahi died in 1884, she left behind one of the most consequential documents in the history of the Pacific. Her will. In that will, she transferred her entire estate, the accumulated landholdings of the Kamehameha royal family, to a charitable trust. The stated purpose of that trust was to establish and support schools for the education of Hawaiian children. Those schools would become the Kamehameha schools, and that trust would become the Bishop Estate, now formally known as the Kamehameha Schools Bishop Estate, or simply Key Speak. The land she transferred was staggering, over 375 zero-zen acres across the Hawaiian Islands. To put that in perspective, that is approximately 9% of all the land in the entire state of Hawaii. One trust, one family's royal inheritance, 9% of an entire American state. Now, in 1884, 375, 0 acres of volcanic rock and tropical scrubland might not have seemed like the most liquid asset in the world. Hawaii was not yet a state. Tourism was a fantasy. The sugar and pineapple industries were growing, but the idea of Honolulu as a global destination, of Maui as a luxury resort mecca, of the Big Island as a billionaire retreat, was generations away. What Princess Pauahi's trustees could not have fully imagined was that the land she left behind would one day sit beneath hotels worth billions, beneath shopping centers generating hundreds of millions annually in revenue, beneath residential developments housing tens of thousands, and beneath the most valuable tourism infrastructure in the entire United States. The trust she created would not just preserve a legacy, it would become one of the wealthiest private landowners in the United States of America. Today, the Bishop Estate, through the Kamehameha Schools, controls assets estimated at between $9 and $12 billion, making it one of the largest private landholders and charitable trusts in the entire country. It owns more land in Hawaii than any individual, any corporation, or any government entity other than the federal government itself, and the federal government's holdings are largely military reservations. What the Bishop Estate controls is productive land, commercial land, coastal land, the land that generates wealth. But here is where the story gets complicated, because a trust designed to educate Hawaiian children somehow ended up at the center of one of the most explosive political scandals in the history of the state. A scandal involving secret deals, cronyism, billion-dollar mismanagement, and 5 trustees who turned a sacred educational mission into a vehicle for personal enrichment on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. To understand how that happened, you need to understand the structure of the trust itself, and how it was governed for more than a century. Princess Pauahi's will specify that the trust be governed by 5 trustees, and crucially, she specified that those trustees should always be justices of the Hawaiian Supreme Court. Her reasoning was sound and noble. Judges were, in theory, insulated from political pressure, educated in law, and committed to fiduciary duty. They were the most trustworthy class of people in the formal public life of the islands. This arrangement worked reasonably well for decades, but after Hawaii became a state in 1959, the rules changed. Supreme Court justices were now presidential appointees operating within the federal legal framework. The idea of sitting judges also serving as trustees of a private estate created obvious conflicts of interest, so the arrangement shifted. Trustees were no longer required to be sitting justices. They were appointed by the probate court, which in practice meant they were appointed by whoever had influence over the probate court. And in Hawaii, where political and business circles overlap in ways that would make Manhattan dynasts blush, that meant the trustees became political appointments in everything but name. For most of the 20th century, this was fine, or at least functional. The estate was conservatively managed, the schools were operated, the land was leased rather than sold, because selling would reduce the principle of the trust. The Bishop Estate became the largest landowner in Hawaii almost by default, by simply holding and never selling while everyone around them did deals. Hawaiian homeowners, businesses, hotels, resorts, and developers all found themselves sitting on land they did not own, paying lease rent to the Bishop Estate. This is the ground lease model taken to its most extraordinary extreme. You could own the most beautiful hotel on Waikiki Beach, and the Bishop estate would own the ground it stood on. You could build a shopping center in Honolulu, and every month you would write a check to the trust. This model generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually in what was essentially passive income. The trust collected rent on land it had never developed, never managed, and never improved. The land itself was the asset. And in Hawaii, land only went one way in value, up. Came 1995, and everything changed. In 1995, the state's probate court, responding to political maneuvering that would make a Tammany Hall operator blush, appointed 5 new trustees to the Bishop estate. These 5 individuals, Lokalani Lindsay, Oswald Sturr, Gerard Jervis, Henry Peters, and Richard Wong, would go on to preside over what historians, journalists, and legal scholars have called the most egregious abuse of a charitable trust in American history. Their compensation alone was the first alarm bell. Each trustee was receiving between $800,000 and $1 million annually. To put that in perspective, the trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, overseeing billions in assets, earned a fraction of that. The Harvard Management Company, which oversees the largest university endowment in the world, paid its CEO far less as a percentage of assets than the Bishop estate was paying 5 political appointees. But the compensation was just the surface. The deeper corruption was in the deals. The trustees began making investments that had nothing to do with the trust's charitable mission. They poured hundreds of millions of dollars into speculative mainland real estate ventures, into businesses with connections to the trustees themselves, and into deals structured in ways that made oversight nearly impossible. They hired vendors and contractors with personal and political ties to trustees. They bullied employees of the Kamehameha schools who raised concerns. One trustee, Lokalani Lindsay, became notorious for her micromanagement of the schools themselves, interfering with curriculum, intimidating teachers, and creating an atmosphere of fear that drove away experienced educators. The students, the very Hawaiian children whose education was the entire point of the trust, were caught in the middle. The institution that Princess Pauahi had created to protect and elevate her people was being used as an ATM by a group of politically connected operators. And the most extraordinary part of all of this is how the scandal finally broke. It didn't break because of a government investigation. It didn't break because of a whistleblower in the legal sense of the word. It broke because of a group of Hawaiian school teachers and community members who wrote an anonymous essay. That essay, published in the Honolulu Star Bulletin in 1997, laid out in devastating detail the malfeasance of the 5 trustees. It was signed simply, "Broken Trust," by a group of prominent citizens including a former state attorney general, a university professor, and several community leaders. The essay sparked a firestorm. The media picked it up. The public was outraged. The Internal Revenue Service, which had the power to revoke the trust's tax-exempt status over mismanagement, opened an investigation. The state attorney general launched an inquiry, and one by one the trustees began to fall. By 1999, all 5 trustees had either resigned or been removed. The cleanup that followed was massive. New trustees were brought in. A professional management structure was implemented. The speculative investments were unwound. The compensation of trustees was dramatically reduced and subjected to court oversight. And the Bishop estate, after years of scandal, returned to its core mission. But here is the thing about the Bishop estate scandal that most people miss when they tell this story. The scandal was about governance. It was about corruption. It was about human greed operating inside an institution that was supposed to be above such things. But the scandal did not change the fundamental reality of what the Bishop's estate is. It is still the largest private landowner in Hawaii. It still owns 9% of the state. It still collects ground lease rent from hundreds of commercial and residential tenants. It still controls billions of dollars in assets. The corruption was removed. The land was not, and the land is the real story. To understand what that land ownership means in practice, you have to look at what the Bishop Estate actually sits on. Start with Honolulu, the heart of Oahu, the most commercially active urban area in the Pacific. The Bishop Estate owns significant portions of some of the most valuable commercial real estate in downtown Honolulu. The Ala Moana Center, for decades the largest shopping mall in the United States, sits on land that is, in part, leased from the Bishop Estate. The Ala Moana Center generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually in retail sales. It is the crown jewel of Hawaiian commercial real estate, an outdoor luxury mall that serves both the residents of Honolulu and the millions of tourists who pour through Honolulu International Airport every year. And the ground it stands on belongs to a trust created by a Hawaiian princess in 1884. Move to Kakako, the rapidly gentrifying neighborhood between downtown Honolulu and Waikiki. Kakako is ground zero for the luxury condo explosion that has transformed Honolulu's skyline over the past 15 years. Towers like Waiea, Anaha, Ao, and Ali have risen to redefine urban living in Hawaii, attracting wealthy buyers from the mainland, from Japan, from China, and from Australia. Many of these developments sit on land leased from the Bishop Estate through its development arm, which for years operated under the name Kamehameha Schools. The trust doesn't always develop the land itself. It leases it to developers who build the towers, sell the condos, and pay lease rent to the Bishop Estate in perpetuity. The developer takes the construction risk. The trust takes the permanent income. It is an arrangement of almost pure genius from the landowner's perspective. Move to the north shore of Oahu, to Lae, to Kahuku, to the agricultural lands of the windward side. Here the Bishop Estate holds vast acreage that has been the subject of intense debate for decades. Some of this land is agricultural. Some of it is fallow. Some of it is in the path of development pressure that never seems to fully materialize because the trust, under its charitable mandate, cannot simply sell land whenever a developer waves a check. Any disposition of trust assets must be approved by the probate court and must serve the charitable mission. This restriction, which frustrates developers, is also what has preserved Hawaiian landscapes that would otherwise have been paved over decades ago. The Bishop Estate is, paradoxically, one of the most significant forces for conservation in Hawaii, not out of ideology, but out of legal necessity. Now move to the neighbor islands, to Maui, where the trust holds land in areas of extraordinary natural beauty and escalating real estate value. The Kapalua Coast, the slopes of Haleakala, the agricultural valleys of the interior, to the Big Island, where vast tracts of land in the Kohala district, among the most desired real estate in the Pacific for luxury resort development, are held by the trust. To Kauai, the Garden Island, where land values have exploded in the post-pandemic era as wealthy Americans discovered that the most remote and beautiful island in the Hawaiian chain was also accessible by direct flight from the West Coast. The Bishop Estate is present on all of these islands. Its footprint is not just the footprint of a charitable organization. It is the footprint of a sovereign. And this is where we have to talk about the political dimension of this story. Because it's a state with a population of about 1.4 million people, where the political culture is deeply interconnected, where unions and Democratic Party politics and Native Hawaiian advocacy groups all overlap in complex ways, the Bishop Estate is not just an economic actor. It is a political one. The appointment of trustees has always been political. Even after the reforms of the late 1990s and early 2000s, the process of selecting trustees is subject to enormous political pressure. The trust controls enough land and enough economic activity that its decisions about development, about lease renewal terms, about what it does with fallow agricultural land affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. When the trust decides to raise lease rents, homeowners who thought they owned their homes in Honolulu suddenly find themselves facing dramatically higher annual costs, sometimes costs that threaten to push them out of homes, their families have occupied for generations. This is the dark side of the ground lease model. The Bishop Estate owns the land under tens of thousands of residential properties across Oahu. Many of these homeowners bought their homes in good faith, understanding that they owned the structure but not the ground. For decades, when the leases were written in the mid-20th century, the lease rents were low enough that this was a manageable arrangement. But as Hawaiian land values have skyrocketed, driven by tourism, by foreign investment, by the desirability of Hawaii as a place to live and own property, the lease rents have been renegotiated, and the renegotiations have sometimes been brutal. Homeowners have found that the new lease rent, set at a percentage of the current land value, has multiplied 5 or 10 times beyond what they were previously paying. For families on fixed incomes, for working-class Hawaiian families who bought into communities in the 1960s and 1970s, this has been catastrophic. The Bishop Estate, the charitable trust created to benefit Native Hawaiians, became in the eyes of many of those very Hawaiians a force that was pricing them out of their own homes. The Hawaii legislature responded to this crisis by passing laws in the 1960s that allowed residential ZCs to purchase the land beneath their homes through a process of mandatory sale. This was an extraordinary exercise of government power, essentially forcing the Bishop Estate to sell land it had held for generations. The trust challenged this legislation all the way to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that it was an unconstitutional taking of private property. In 1984, in the landmark case Hawaii Housing Authority v. Midkiff, the Supreme Court upheld the Hawaii Land Reform Act. The trust lost, and over the following decades, thousands of Honolulu homeowners were able to purchase fee-simple ownership of the land beneath their homes. But the process was slow, expensive, and incomplete. There are still thousands of residential leaseholders in Hawaii. And in the commercial sector, where no such mandatory purchase laws apply, the Bishop Estate remains the landlord in perpetuity. The financial architecture of the Bishop Estate in the modern era is a study in institutional sophistication. After the scandals of the 1990s, the trust hired professional managers and investment advisors, restructuring itself as something closer to a modern university endowment than a family real estate operation. The asset base is now broadly diversified. Yes, the Hawaiian land holdings remain the foundation, but the trust's investment portfolio now includes equities, fixed income, private equity, real estate investment trusts operating on the mainland, and various other instruments designed to generate the returns necessary to fund the Kamehameha schools. The Kamehameha schools are not a minor educational operation. They are 3 campuses on Oahu, Maui, and the Big Island, educating thousands of Hawaiian students from preschool through 12th grade. The schools are private, and tuition is heavily subsidized by the trust, making a Kamehameha education accessible to Hawaiian families who could not otherwise afford a private school education of this quality. The schools consistently rank among the best in the state of Hawaii. They have produced politicians, athletes, doctors, lawyers, artists, and community leaders. They are, in a genuine and meaningful way, the fulfillment of Princess Pauahi's vision. This is the complexity that makes the Bishop Estate unlike any other institution we could discuss. It is simultaneously a massive commercial real estate empire, a powerful political actor, and an institution of genuine social purpose. The trust is not a villain. It is not a hero. It is something more complicated and more interesting than either of those things. But let us talk about the money more specifically, because the numbers are extraordinary, and they deserve to be stated plainly. The Bishop Estate's Hawaiian land holdings, approximately 375,000 acres, represent roughly 9% of Hawaii's total land area of approximately 4 million acres. Of that land, significant portions are in urban and suburban areas where land values are among the highest in the United States. Honolulu real estate has long tracked with San Francisco and New York as among the most expensive markets in the country. The median home price in Honolulu consistently exceeds $1 million. Commercial land values in prime Honolulu locations run to hundreds of dollars per square foot. Even conservative estimates of the per-acre value of the Bishop Estate's holdings produce numbers in the billions of dollars. The Trust's annual ground lease revenues from commercial and residential tenants have historically been estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Layer on top of that the investment portfolio, the commercial development activities, and the revenues generated by various subsidiary operations, and you have an institution with annual cash flows that dwarf those of most private companies. This is not a struggling charity. This is one of the wealthiest private institutions in the United States of America. Now, here is where the story gets even more layered. Because the Bishop Estate does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in a state that has its own complex history of land ownership, where the question of who owns what is bound up with questions of sovereignty, of colonialism, of racial justice, and of native rights in ways that make a simple financial analysis completely insufficient. When Princess Pauahi created the trust in 1884, Hawaii was still a kingdom. 9 years later, in 1893, a group of American businessmen, with the support of United States Marines stationed in Honolulu Harbor, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and established a provisional government. In 1898, despite the formal protest of the native Hawaiian population, the United States annexed Hawaii. In 1959, it became a state. Throughout all of this, the Bishop Estate remained. The trust survived the overthrow of the monarchy, the annexation, the territorial period, and statehood. It survived because it was a private legal entity, a charitable trust, established under laws that continued to be recognized through each successive political transformation. The trust's survival through these upheavals is itself a remarkable story of legal and institutional resilience. But it also means that the Bishop Estate carries within it the unresolved tensions of Hawaiian history. The trust was established with the wealth of the royal family that was overthrown. It was designed to benefit a people who were colonized, and it is now one of the most powerful economic actors in a state that is debating, in very serious terms, the question of Native Hawaiian sovereignty. The Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which seeks various forms of self-governance, ranging from recognition as a domestic dependent nation to full independence, views the Bishop Estate with a mixture of pride and frustration. Pride because the trust represents the survival of the Kamehameha legacy and the continued economic presence of Hawaiian royalty in the modern world. Frustration because the trust's wealth, enormous as it is, has not been sufficient to address the profound socioeconomic disadvantages that Native Hawaiians continue to face as a group. By almost every measure of social and economic well-being, Native Hawaiians are among the most disadvantaged communities in the state of Hawaii and in the broader United States. Native Hawaiians have the highest rates of homelessness in Hawaii. They have higher rates of chronic disease, lower median incomes, and lower educational attainment than the state average. They are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and underrepresented in positions of economic and political power. This is not because of any failure of individual effort. It is the accumulated legacy of dispossession, of having had your land taken, your language suppressed, your culture marginalized, and your political sovereignty extinguished over the course of a century and a half. The Bishop Estate, for all its billions, has not been able to fully counteract these forces. And there are those within the Hawaiian community who argue that it should be doing far more, that the trust's fiduciary conservatism, its focus on maintaining and growing the asset base, has come at the cost of more aggressive investment in the Hawaiian community. There are others who argue the opposite, that the trust's primary obligation is to its schools, and that expanding its social mission would compromise its financial sustainability. This debate is ongoing, unresolved, and deeply felt. It is the debate of a community trying to determine what justice looks like, when the instruments of justice are themselves complicated products of history. Let us talk about the trustees, because the trustees of the Bishop Estate are among the most powerful unelected figures in the state of Hawaii. There are 5 of them, appointed by a process that involves the state's probate court and is influenced by a nominations committee. Their compensation, while nothing like the grotesque excess of the 1990s, is still substantial. Each trustee earns over $100,000 annually. Each serves a staggered 9-year term. Together they control investment decisions, land development strategies, and the educational policy of the Kamehameha schools, which between them educate several thousand students across the 3 campuses. The process of selecting trustees has been reformed, but it remains politically sensitive. Every appointment is scrutinized by the Hawaiian community, by advocacy groups, by the state legislature, and by the press. Who sits on the board of the Bishop Estate determines how the largest pool of private wealth in Hawaii's history is deployed. That is not an abstract concern. It is the most consequential governance question in the state. The current leadership of the trust has made deliberate efforts to be more transparent, more community-focused, and more aligned with contemporary standards of nonprofit governance. The trust publishes annual reports. It engages in community consultation processes for major land decisions. It has expanded its pre-kindergarten education programs, recognizing that the pipeline to higher educational achievement begins before formal schooling. It has invested in Hawaiian language revitalization, supporting immersion programs that are helping to bring back a language that was nearly extinguished during the territorial period. It has built partnerships with universities and medical institutions to address the health disparities that affect Native Hawaiians. These are real accomplishments, but they are also the minimum that one would expect from an institution of this wealth and this historical responsibility. Now let us talk about what the future holds for the Bishop Estate, because Hawaii is changing. The state is at the center of a collision between multiple powerful forces that will determine what the islands look like and who they belong to in the coming decades. The first force is the tourism economy. Hawaii receives roughly 10 million visitors a year, generating roughly $17 billion in annual visitor spending. Tourism is the lifeblood of the Hawaiian economy, and it is deeply dependent on land. Hotels, resorts, vacation rentals, the infrastructure that supports the hospitality industry, all of it requires land. And the Bishop Estate, as the largest private landowner, is always in the room when major tourism development decisions are being made. The trust has been cautious about large-scale resort development, partly because of its charitable mandate, partly because of community opposition, and partly because of a genuine recognition that overdevelopment threatens the natural beauty that makes Hawaii valuable in the first place. But the pressure never goes away. There is always someone with a check wanting to develop land on a Hawaiian coastline. And as long as the Bishop Estate owns that coastline, the trust is the gatekeeper. The second force is the housing crisis. Hawaii has one of the most severe housing affordability crises in the United States. The median home price on Oahu is well over $1 million. The rental market is brutally expensive. Homelessness is a persistent and visible problem in Honolulu. The state needs tens of thousands of new housing units, particularly affordable and workforce housing. The Bishop Estate owns land that could be developed for housing. The question of how much of that land should be made available, at what cost, and with what affordability requirements is one of the most politically charged questions in Hawaii. The trust is not a housing developer and does not see itself as one, but its land holdings are so large that it cannot escape the political pressure to be part of the solution. The trust has made commitments to make land available for affordable housing development. But critics argue that the pace is too slow and the scale too small relative to the crisis. The third force is climate change. Hawaii is extraordinarily vulnerable to the effects of a changing climate. Sea level rise threatens coastal communities. Increased hurricane intensity threatens the tourism's infrastructure that drives the economy. Changes in rainfall patterns threaten the agricultural lands and the freshwater supplies that sustain the islands. The Bishop Estate, as the owner of vast coastal and agricultural land, is on the front lines of these threats. Some of its most valuable land, the coastal commercial properties, the luxury resort sites, the beachfront parcels, are precisely the land most at risk from sea level rise and storm surge. The trust is going to have to make decisions in the coming decades about which land to develop, which to hold, and which to let return to a more natural state as the ocean reclaims the shoreline. The fourth force is the sovereignty movement. The question of native Hawaiian self-governance has moved from the margins to the mainstream of American political debate. The federal government has for decades operated a system of special programs and entitlements for native Hawaiians, recognizing their status as an indigenous people, but has stopped short of the formal political recognition that other indigenous groups receive under federal Indian law. Efforts to establish a formal Hawaiian governing entity have moved forward slowly and controversially over the years. The Bishop Estate occupies an unusual position in this movement. The trust is the largest holder of wealth originally derived from Hawaiian royal land. If Native Hawaiians ever achieve some form of formal political sovereignty, questions about the relationship between that sovereign entity and the Bishop Estate will inevitably arise. Would a Hawaiian sovereign government have claims on some of the trust's assets? Would the trust's land holdings be subject to different legal treatment? These are not hypothetical questions. They are questions that Hawaiian lawyers, scholars, and activists are already debating. What makes the Bishop Estate so extraordinary, so unlike any other institution we might compare it to, is this combination of factors. It is at once a feudal relic and a modern investment fund. It is at once a colonial artifact and a vehicle for indigenous cultural survival. It is at once one of the wealthiest private institutions in America and an organization whose fundamental purpose is educational equity for a marginalized people. There is nothing else quite like it in the world. The Rockefeller family fortune, dispersed across multiple generations and multiple entities, is no longer controlled by a single institution.